May only your word be spoken, O Lord. May only your word be heard. Amen. Jesus was killed by the Roman Empire. As a heretic and possible insurrectionist, he had no political power, rejected political power when it was offered to him, both by Satan and his temptations in the wilderness, and by Jesus' followers when they wanted to make him king. He desired no earthly political power and taught no earthly political power for his followers. You will be handed over to the authorities, he said, not you will become the authorities to deal out punishment and death to others. Jesus' church, therefore, remained a religious movement without great earthly authority for over 300 years. The church did not rule over others with political or governmental power. Rather, the authority of the church only came from influence that they had by their relationships of love and service with others. Jesus was the king of the church, and people followed his rule by living his teachings. Love one another. Pray for your enemies. Do not return anyone evil for evil. If you have more than you need, share generously with others. Live lives of prayer, service, and above all, love. That also includes having fun and enjoying life, working, being with friends and family. Love God, love people, and let everything else flow from that. However imperfectly Jesus' followers lived that life of love, and they did live that way imperfectly, such is the church with Jesus as king. Love God, love people, and let everything else flow from that. Then, in the year 380, Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official state religion of Roman Empire. And at that point, I would argue that the Emperor of Rome usurped Jesus' role as king of the church, at least in any earthly sense. At that point, the church had political power and authority to force others to follow its desires. War, for example, was not the way of Jesus. But once the church and the empire were united, when the empire went to war, the church went to war. Rather than love and pray for one's enemies, the church began killing their enemies at the point of a sword. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, the church was often closely tied to the government in many nations with great political power and authority. It seems like the church got so used to ruling, and the power of the church remained tied to the power of the state. When Christopher Columbus first came to the Americas, he came to the modern-day Bahamas, and he claimed the land for Spain and decided to convert people to Christianity. And the conversions didn't really take all that well. And over the decades, the kings of Spain ordered forced conversions, and the church complied. Believe in Jesus or be tortured and killed. That's what the church looked like with an earthly king as its head, forcing people to believe in Jesus, destroying their religious sites, enslaving people, and killing those who resisted. That's a far cry from love God, love people, and let everything else flow from that. Amen. Forced conversions are not what God intended for us. Coerced conversions, making people terrified of what will happen to them if they don't believe in Jesus, is not what God intended for us. Amen. Offering our beliefs to others that they may find healing that we have found. That's what God intends. Be a light. Be a light, Jesus taught us. A light attracts people in the darkness. A light of loving God amidst the darkness of hatred. The light of taking care of one another against the darkness of indifference. The light of hope amidst the darkness of despair. Bringing light into the darkness is kind of God's deal. In the beginning, when the earth was nothing but a formless void and darkness reigned everywhere, God said, "Let there be light," and light shined into the darkness. When God made humanity, God gave us some of God's own power so that we could rule over creation and care for this wonderful earth. We've not always done a particularly good job of that. But we see God continuing to love us, continuing to walk with us, continuing to shine light into the darkness. When God formed the people of Israel, God made them to be a light to the nations. Love God and love people, God taught. Be a light to others by how you live. If you loan someone money, don't charge interest. Use what you have to help someone else out who is in need, and trust that they'll do the same if things are reversed. If you really want to please God, take care of the poor and needy among you. Care for the orphans and widows. If you're really angry with someone, leave vengeance to God, trusting God's justice even when it doesn't seem to happen on earth. Now, the people of Israel didn't always follow God's ways, and eventually they even asked for a king to lead them like other nations. God warned them that the king would take all of the best of what everyone had for himself. The king would take their sons to fight in his wars and their daughters to serve him in his palace, and the people said, "That sounds great." So the people rejected God as their king and decided to have an earthly king instead. It didn't work out all that well, as you might imagine, but God loved the people of Israel enough to let them make that mistake. Then God continued striving with the people of Israel so that despite all of their very human screw-ups, they continue to be a light to the nations to this day. When Jesus founded the church, he called his disciples a light to shine in the darkness for all. "Love one another as I have loved you," he told them. That is the light he wanted his disciples to shine. Love for one another. Jesus wanted his disciples to attract others to them by loving one another, by being light. Now, the church has screwed up plenty over the centuries, and through it all, Jesus has stuck with us. When the church went so far as to reject Jesus as king and began relying on the power of the Roman Empire instead, things went wonky, and Jesus continued to strive with his church. Jesus continued loving humanity. Jesus continued shining as a light for us to turn to when darkness overcame us. Now, I'd love to say that the church no longer rejects Jesus as king, but we know that's not true. Even without the tyranny of the Roman Empire or the genocidal expansion of colonialism, there are plenty of ways that pockets of the modern church still reject Jesus as king. Think of the Ku Klux Klan, which claimed Christianity as their faith, and yet their king was not Jesus, but themselves, and fear of others and being displaced or devalued. Think of Christian groups who use the government to try to force Christianity on others, rather than trying to attract others simply by the light of love. They may think of Jesus as their king, but Jesus didn't use a government or anything else to force his beliefs on anybody. Think about Christian groups who are constantly threatening people with eternal torture if they don't believe in Jesus. Conversions based on threats aren't forced conversions, but they are coerced conversions with a foundation of fear rather than a foundation of Jesus. Fear is king in such pockets of Christianity, with Jesus simply serving to alleviate that fear. Forcing people to believe, scaring people into believing, using Jesus as a weapon to achieve one victory or another. Pockets of the church that do these kinds of things have the wrong king in charge. Jesus didn't force anything on anyone. When push came to shove, he let himself be killed rather than rise up in revolt against Rome. Jesus' way was to let Rome do their horrible, oppressive, imperial stuff. And he and his disciples were going to be the church. In the darkness of empire and authoritarianism, Jesus was king by living the light of love. Jesus lived the lights of faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of those lights was love. That light of Jesus' love still shines in the darkness. The great love that God has for us shines in the darkness, and our faith and hope, the light that shines in the darkness, is ultimately that great love.